Right now, financial markets are locked onto a single metric, the price of crude oil crossing $120 a barrel. This is a lethal analytical error. The actual systemic threat bearing down on global stability is the friction of kinetic warfare outpacing our logistical capacity to regenerate. Raw crude oil is merely potential energy. To move fleets, power grids, and supply chains, you need actual kinetic energy, specifically refined middle distillates like diesel. The global logistical heart has plenty of raw blood. The problem is that the valves and vessels required to process it are actively being destroyed. Watching the price ticker for unrefined crude obscures the real crisis. The immediate danger is a complete physical stop of the diesel supply chain. Military strategists refer to this crisis as the Kinetic-Logistic Inversion. We have crossed a mathematical threshold where the armed forces burn more energy securing fuel than those operations actually yield. This diagram displays the Vanguard inversion coefficient, dividing kinetic fuel expenditure and friction by net diesel yield. If the output exceeds 1.0, the military enters active ischemia, starving itself to fight. Current reports show we are operating at a catastrophic 1.42. Under these specific conditions, the United States military is actively cannibalizing its own strategic reserves simply to keep its machinery running for another day. To understand why this inversion is happening, we must examine the top half of the equation, the burn-to-yield paradox. Every single day, U.S. naval and air assets expend massive quantities of high-grade fuel for the singular purpose of suppressing drone swarms and physically maintaining open international tanker routes. This expenditure is compounded by a secondary friction point, known as the atrophy of replacement. Because global supply chains are severed, battle damage to advanced airframes is now permanent. The F-15E Strike Eagle, a cornerstone of 2026 air superiority, relies on specialized exterior hardware that can no longer be sourced or repaired in theater. This attrition extends downward to rugged support airframes like the A-10 Warthog. They require a continuous flow of specialized replacement parts that no longer exist. The military is caught in a closed loop. The microchips and aerospace resins required for repairs depend entirely on the exact maritime trade routes the aircraft are failing to secure. Because replacement is mathematically impossible, every missile launched and jet scrambled burns irreplaceable resources, accelerating the systemic failure of the entire force. The denominator of the Vanguard equation reveals the second half of the crisis, a global feedstock famine colliding with domestic political friction. Global refining capacity is heavily specialized. When infrastructure designed for specific grades of crude is destroyed, the system is forced to rely on alternative oils that inherently yield less middle distillate. Recent precision kinetic strikes in the Middle East, specifically targeting Kuwaiti infrastructure, have permanently eliminated 10% of the world's seaborne upgrading capacity. This side-by-side bar chart illustrates the resulting volumetric collapse. Without that specialized upgrading infrastructure, the middle distillate yield from a standard barrel of replacement crude drops from 33% down to 25%. Domestically, this shortage is triggering the domestic tether. State governments are actively using their authority to block the federal government from extracting localized fuel. Under the Gulf Sovereignty Protocol, state guards are utilizing administrative obstruction to physically secure critical nodes, like the Valero Port Arthur refinery, against federal marshals. The military is trapped in a lethal double bind. It faces diminished fuel yields internationally, while its remaining domestic reserves are barricaded behind constitutional firewalls. By combining the high expenditure numerator with the collapsed yield denominator, we can calculate the exact date of global logistical failure. While long-term models project a crude oil shortage by September, the critical Vanguard metric is the immediate diesel fracture slated for July 3rd. Factoring in all variables, the global supply chain is currently operating at a net daily deficit of negative 7.6 million barrels. This cross-section graphic represents the global distillate stock, starting with a total pool of 1,400 million barrels spread across international storage. The vital boundary line is the suction limit, marked firmly at the bottom 25% of the system. That bottom 350 million barrels constitutes the minimum operational level. It is dead stock, physically inaccessible fluid required exclusively to maintain pipeline pressure. If pumps attempt to draw fuel below this operational threshold, they trigger a catastrophic mechanical failure known as a dry spill. Drawing below the limit pulls air pockets directly into the pipelines. The resulting violent pressure loss permanently destroys the pumping infrastructure. Tracking the 7.6 million barrel deficit against active supply leaves us with a hard mathematical floor. We hit the dead stock threshold precisely on July 3, 2026. On July 3rd, the physical infrastructure of the global logistical network reaches an absolute mechanical stop. The mechanical failure on July 3rd triggers an immediate civil crisis through a mechanism known as trophic decoupling. Once the supply chain fractures, food prices completely disconnect from traditional dollar inflation. Price becomes entirely linked to the physical availability of diesel. The global agricultural system relies heavily on nitrogen-based fertilizers. Currently, 30% of global urea supply is physically trapped behind Middle Eastern naval blockades. This creates a double bind for the May 15th planting deadline. Seeds will not yield without the missing urea, and they cannot physically be planted without diesel. Modern heavy agricultural machinery is entirely dependent on middle distillates. Without fuel, these highly advanced platforms become useless stationary architecture. The direct projection for the Northern Hemisphere winter wheat harvest is severe. The crop will be physically unharvestable, left to rot in the open fields, regardless of its market value. By August, collapsing just-in-time calorie delivery will force the Pentagon into an impossible choice: use the remaining fuel to project power overseas, or deploy forces to suppress famine riots at domestic grocery hubs. With the centralized supply chain facing inevitable mathematical failure, survival requires an immediate pivot to cellular synthesis. The tactical solution for local commanders and state governments is implementing the shadow refinery protocol. We must replace massive, vulnerable refining plants with stealthy, modular atmospheric distillation units, hidden entirely within standard shipping container footprints. These decentralized units operate on scavenger logic. They bypass the feedstock famine by processing local crude, transmix, or biolipids directly into tactical-grade diesel. To distribute the product safely, operators utilize encrypted digital fuel ledgers. This allows localized dark trade, bypassing federal tracking to deliver fuel strictly to verified local nodes. When the centralized grid goes dark, this protocol ensures a resilient cellular network of off-grid nodes can quietly spark to life in the vacuum. Warning tone: operating a shadow node requires strict adherence to security protocols. Units depend on state-level legal protection from federal seizure, and the fuel requires continuous secondary filtration to avoid destroying sensitive military engines. The era of centralized abundance is mathematically over. Analysts must direct their areas of operation to build this shadow network immediately, because the July fracture is a certainty.